Well, good morning once again, Encompass Church. Glad that you are here. Thankful for your part in worship. Thankful for the band leading us faithfully. Just as we were singing that song, thinking about how the Spirit moves and works in our lives. And like Mitchell was saying, sometimes the Holy Spirit is treated like the awkward cousin who shows up to the family reunions. But the Holy Spirit is who moves and works in us through God's power. But glad you're here. If you're new, just let me say this is a good place, we believe, for you to come no matter where you find yourself in your walk spiritually. So maybe you've been a believer for a long time and you just want to deepen your faith. We believe that God has commanded us to join together with a local church. Maybe you're new in the faith. Maybe you have no faith at all. We want to present to you, want to lay it out before you, this Jesus who has died in your place for your sin. But if you got a copy of God's Word with you, go ahead and grab those. Be turning with us once again to the book of Judges. And so what we've been doing for several weeks now, been going through this series entitled Rescue Needed. And so what we've been looking at, we've been seeing the sin of the people of Israel. So them just in rebellion to God, just not really wanting who He was and what He had done for them. They were not paying any attention to that. And because of that, because of their sin, there was consequences to their sin. And so they were oppressed by foreign enemies. And so what would happen, the progression through the book, God would raise up these deliverers, these rescuers, these judges who would come to save God's people because God is a faithful, compassionate, merciful God. And so last week we were introduced to a deliverer that we're going to continue with today, the mighty, the strong Samson the Nazarite. And so last week we talked about the unexpected birth of Samson. So last week essentially we looked at the good part of Samson's life. So if Samson had a choice in the matter, he probably would choose to take his superhuman strength and rip out chapters 14 through 16 of every Bible in the world. Because now where we come when it comes to Samson, we get to see him not in all his glory, but really in all his sinfulness. Really in all of his depravity. So now is where we get to see the seemingly strong Samson turn out to be surprisingly weak. And so for this morning, we're going to continue with the same main point that we had last week. It doesn't matter how strong you might seem on the outside. If you're weak on the inside, it will not end well. And so with that, let's pray, ask the Spirit's help, and jump in this morning. Father, we come to you once again through our risen Lord. God, we thank you that even when we know not what to pray, God, the Spirit intercedes for us. And so, God, I just ask this morning that your word would be lifted up high and holy, infallible as it is. God, would you speak to us? God, would we just have eyes to see the hope that you've given us? God, help us to concentrate on the inheritance that the saints have through the blood of Jesus. And I pray that this would be a work of the Spirit this morning. What we are not, would you make us? What we have not, would you give us? We pray these things through Christ. Amen. So Judges chapter 14, again, is where we're going to pick up this morning. And in this chapter, we're going to see a riddle from Samson. And so I think that means before we get going this morning, that we need to do a little riddle work as well. So let me ask, how many of you in here love some riddle action? Okay. How many of you love anything in life? Because I don't know if y'all don't know, when I do this, it means to raise your hand if you agree or not. But look, let's do some riddle action this morning. Just give you a couple for you to think about, and then we'll dive into our text this morning. So riddle number 1. Johnny's mother had 3 children. The first child was named April. The second child was named May. Now, don't give the answer yet. Think about it. Don't be that person. What was the third child's name? Some people are that person. That child's name would be Johnny, right? Because Johnny's mother. So that was an easy one. Now, some of you wanted to say June. You think, oh, no, maybe I'm wrong about that. The second one, a prisoner is forced to go into one of 3 rooms. But that person can choose which room to go into. The first room is ablaze with fire. The second one is rigged with explosives set to go off as soon as you open the door. The third room contains a pair of lions who haven't eaten in years. So which room would you choose to go into? Which one do we think? Has to be the lions, right? Because why? If the lions haven't eaten in years, what does that mean? The lions are dead. Some of y'all are good at this. Some of you are not good at this. Couple more. Can you name 3 consecutive days of the week without using the words Wednesday, Friday, or Sunday? Or can you name 3 consecutive days without using the words Wednesday, Friday, or Sunday? Who was it? Somebody? Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Anybody get that one besides a couple people over there? Some of y'all are just so smart. Now let's go with this one. Last one. Scott has $28.75. Everybody's like, oh, the math portion. Math stinks. We don't want to do this. He purchased 3 cookies that cost $1.50, 5 newspapers that cost 50 cents, 5 flowers for $1.25, and used the remainder of the cash for sunglasses. How much money did the sunglasses cost? We don't have time to kind of wait on this, do we? It's like, we could be here for hours and days for some of us. The correct answer would have been $15.50. But look, this morning, as much as we might like riddles or we might hate riddles, doesn't really matter. What we're going to see this morning is not necessarily a fun riddle for Samson. So what we're going to see in our text, this was not one of those lighthearted riddles where, hey, if you get it, great. If you don't, it doesn't really matter. No, instead, the riddle that Samson gives escalates into a killing frenzy. Like it sets off some very evil events. So let's pick up at verse 1 of chapter 14, where we kind of fast forward from Samson's birth and now into his adulthood as we read in God's Word. Samson went down to Timnah and saw a young Philistine woman there. He went back and told his father and his mother, I have seen a young Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as a wife. But his father and mother said to him, can't you find a young woman among your relatives or among any of our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines for a wife? Look, I just want to point out really quick, what we're seeing here is not a race issue. So his parents' problem with Samson wanting to marry a foreigner had nothing to do with the color of her skin. No, it had to do with the condition of the Philistines' hearts. Like his parents understood, they knew that God's intention was never for someone in the covenant of God to marry someone outside of that covenant. So it was never for God in His plan for a believer to marry an unbeliever. This is what we read about in 2 Corinthians 6:14. Because God knew if a believer marries an unbeliever, that causes all sorts of problems. But just think about this and what we're seeing here. Think about the progression and how far Israel has fallen in all of this. So if we were to go back to the very first judge that we saw, a man by the name of Othniel, what we saw is that Othniel, so he went out, he defeated all the enemies, and then he went and married this woman named Aksa, a godly, faithful, trusting Israelite. But now fast forward, here we are, we're at the last judge in the book. So here we are with Samson. And what does he do? What does he want to do? He wants to go in among Israel's enemies to marry a woman who has no idea about who God is. Listen, this is how far the rejection of the one true God has taken the people of Israel. Like we know the saying, life comes at you fast, but the truth is the results of sin, they come at you fast too, brother. They come at you fast too, sister. Look, even though Samson's parents aren't on board, Samson doesn't really care. Now, I know no parents in the room can relate to telling your child something they don't care about. This is what we see here with Samson. But Samson told his father, get her for me. She's the right one for me. Or she is right in my eyes. In verse 4, now his father and mother did not know this was from the Lord, who wanted the Philistines to provide an opportunity for a confrontation. Now here we have to pause again, because what we see here is really a key verse maybe even the key sentiment in what's going to happen for the rest of Samson's life. So this is a determining factor in what's going to play out in the next few chapters. Look, as we think about what's being said here, let's be real, this can look a little bit confusing. Like, I would say this can and probably even should raise some questions. Like, you think about this. How are we to take what the writer says here? So how are we to take that what's going down with Samson wanting to marry this outsider was from God? Because is that not what it says? It says there, this was from the Lord. It says essentially that this relationship that's just getting started between Samson and this Philistine woman was a part of God's plan. So does that mean that we are to take this to mean that God forced Samson to fall in love with this woman? Is that what that means? No, of course not. He had a choice not to fall in love. You listen, church, you always have a choice to obey or disobey. So does this mean that Samson was actually right in his decision to go after her? No, of course not. He was sinful and wrong in this. He was disobedient to God. He was disobedient to his parents. So don't feel bad for Samson. No, this was his fault. But look, what verse 4 means is this, and it's important that we understand as we go forward. But it's saying this truth, that God hates sin. Hear that, church. God hates sin. But is such a good God that He can work through sin for our good so that we might be delivered from sin. Look, I know that Mitchell was talking about earlier in Acts 2. I think the supreme example of this is seen in Acts 2, where Peter is telling the people when the Holy Spirit came. So he's talking about, hey, this is what God did. God used the human, sinful choices of putting Jesus to death. And God arranged it so that their wickedness only fulfilled His redemptive purposes. So in that we see, through the cross, we see that God worked through their sin to save the world from our sin. And look, this is what God is doing here for the people of Israel. And we know, if you know your word, it's not the first time. We've seen this kind of deal with the story of Joseph, where Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, and then we read at the end of Genesis, but God used their evil for good. But look what's happened to the people. And we kind of touched on this last week. But for the people of Israel, they had gotten so comfortable with where they were at. They had gotten so comfortable in their captivity. Look, they'd gotten to the point they didn't even care that the Philistines had taken over. They were perfectly fine living right alongside their enemies. They were fine living like the people who didn't know God. But listen, God is not going to allow His children to live for long like those who don't know God. Listen, He's not going to be okay with His church trying to assimilate into living like and being like the world. Why? Because the more that we do that, so the more that we live like the world, the more that we take in what they take, the more that we shift into what they believe, the more it's going to lead us to forsake God. The more it leads us to, as James puts it, be adulterous people. See, James 4:4 says, hey, friendship with the world, that's enmity, that's hatred towards God. And so what we're seeing here, God is using Samson's flawed character to accomplish His will. So He's using Samson to bring about necessary confrontation between Israel and their enemies, between Israel and the Philistines. It's like Keller put it. God will use the very weakness of Samson, his sexual appetites, his vindictiveness and temper, to bring about confrontation between these two nations. Samson's weaknesses result in a blood feud that leads to more and more conflict. And finally, the division between the two nations that is so desperately needed. Look, this morning, I would just throw this out there to us. Maybe in your life, there's some conflicts. Maybe in your life, there's some division that's desperately needed between you and some things as well. So the reality is you could be here and you find yourself too preoccupied with certain things. So maybe you're too preoccupied with popularity. Maybe you're too worried about success. or riches or comfort or convenience or whatever it might be. And look, that's true in your life. Be glad when God stirs up some trouble. Be glad when there's some conflict. Be glad when there's some division that's making you uncontent. It's making you unsettled in those things. Like what I'm saying is like treat those difficult things as good things because it can bring you back where you need to be. It reorients you to what really matters. This is what God is trying to do with the people of Israel. Let's read on in verse 5. So Samson, he went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came to the vineyards of Timnah. Which, if you think back to last week, is a strange place to be if you're not allowed to drink from vines. Like, why is he there? I mean, who wants to go to Golden Corral if you can't eat, right? We don't want to go just to look, do we? No, that would be torturous. But suddenly, a young lion came roaring at him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on him, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn a young goat. Look, I don't know if you've ever torn a young goat apart with your hands before or not. If you have, you might want to see a professional counselor about that. But the writer shows us here just how strong, just how powerful Samson was when the Spirit of God came on him. As he takes this attacking lion, I know it seems make-believe. People, this is real. As he takes this attacking lion and rips it apart with his bare hands. So I think about it like me opening a bag of Cheetos. That's the most relatable thing in my life to what Samson does here. He rips this lion apart. Then in verse 7, he went and spoke to the woman because she seemed right to Samson. In other words, because she was a flighty. Does everybody know what a flighty is? That's a Hebrew word for a Philistine hottie. That's what it is. That's what Samson's thinking here. But after some time, when he returned to marry her, he left the road to see the lion's carcass. And there was a swarm of bees with honey in the carcass. So verse 9, so he scooped some honey into his hands and ate it as he went along. Because what else are you supposed to do if you see something sweet inside of a dead animal, right? It's a natural response. Verse 10, his father went to visit the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there. You see, in Hebrew, in actual Hebrew, not like the flighty thing, to feast there means to drink. This means a drunken rager. So Samson throws this wild engagement party as young men were accustomed to do. So much for that Nazarite vow, right? Like we talked about last week, he doesn't seem to care at all about what he was vowed to do. We'll talk more about that momentarily. But verse 11, when the Philistines saw him, they brought 30 men to accompany him. Then in verse 12, we see the riddle. Let me tell you a riddle, Samson said. If you can explain it to me during the feast and figure it out, I'll give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you can't, then you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. Tell us your riddle. They said, let's hear it. So they're like, hey, we know we can solve this. We got an entire week. Go ahead and give it to us. We're going to win this bet. So he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. And we're so good at riddles. Church, do you know the answer to the riddle? You should, shouldn't you? Because we just saw it. We just read about it transpiring with the lion and the honey. Look, even though we know it, even though we've read it, these Philistines, they understandably had no idea. Like they hadn't heard about this lion and the bees making honey in its carcass. So how are they supposed to know? And as time went on, they get impatient. They get upset. They can't figure it out. So they go to Samson's wife, or at least his soon-to-be wife, and they tell her, listen, you've got to find out what the answer to this riddle is. And once you find out, you've got to tell us what the answer is, or if you don't, we're going to kill you. Verse 16. So Samson's wife came to him weeping and said, you hate me and don't love me. You told my people the riddle, but you've not explained it to me. She wept the whole 7 days of the feast. And look, that's what every good party needs, right? A wife who is so mad at her husband, she's crying in the corner the entire time. Ain't a party till that happens. And at last, on the seventh day, he explained it to her because she had nagged him so much. And to be clear, I think this nagging wife here is more descriptive than prescriptive. Let's be clear on that. So I don't think this is like a biblical precedent for wives to be nagging their husbands until they finally give in. I don't think this is what the Lord is speaking through the Spirit to us this morning. And all of them in the room said, Amen. But then she explained it to her people on the seventh day before sunset. So right as the party's about to end, the men of the city said to him, hey, here's your answer to your riddle. What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? So they tell him the answer again. So he says to them, if you hadn't plowed with my young cow or with my heifer, you wouldn't know my riddle. Look, real quick, going back to descriptive versus prescriptive. Okay, this is not prescriptive that men should go around calling their wives cows and heifers. Right? Again, not a good practice. Then in verse 19, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on him, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of their men. He stripped them and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. Which I think honestly brings up another question. Like, why would God fill him with His Spirit? Why would God give him the strength to do something that's obviously vindictive, right? To do something that's obviously vengeful. But look, it's like we've already said. God has a greater purpose through Samson. God has a greater purpose through Samson and the Philistines, creating necessary division. Look, that division just intensifies as we read on, as we jump to chapter 15. Later on, verse 1, during the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat as a gift and visited his wife. So maybe for their date night, they were going to take that young goat and tear it apart. Maybe that was their plan. I want to go to my wife, he said. But her father would not let him enter. And why would he not let her enter? Or let him enter? We see in verse 2. I was sure you hated her. So I gave her to another man. I gave her to one of the men who were accompanying you. And that did not sit well with Samson at all. Like, even though he's offered the apparently younger, better-looking sister, he says in verse 3, Samson said to them, this time I will be blameless when I harm the Philistines. So he went out and caught 300 foxes. Which, another question, how does one go about catching 300 foxes? They make it seem so simple. I don't know that that would be true. But he took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a torch between each pair of tails. And then he takes these foxes that he has set on fire, and he turns them loose in the Philistine fields. And by doing that, he destroys their harvest. So he burns down the Philistines' food supply. Look, church, that's cold-blooded, isn't it? I mean, if you want to make me mad, there's several things you can do. But if you want to make me the most mad, go to my house and burn down my pantry, right? Like burn down my strawberry shortcake rolls, my beef sticks. That's going to upset me a lot. But then as the story goes on, they find out who did this. It was Samson. So they go, and look, Judges is a hard book. It is. They go and they kill this Philistine woman and her father. They actually burn them to death. Just another evidence of how evil the Philistines were, which makes Samson then even angrier. We're just seeing this thing progress along. Then verse 7 of chapter 15, then Samson told them, because you did this, I swear that I won't rest until I've taken vengeance on you. So he tore them limb from limb, and then went down and stayed in the cave at the rock of Elam. As the story goes on, so then the Philistines, they go ask the people of Judah to hand Samson over to them, which they do, which is another sign that Israel's not where they need to be, because they're willing to cut down their own rescuer in order to appease their enemy. But he's tied up at that point, and he's taken to the Philistines. As we read in verse 14. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came to meet him shouting. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on him. Again, we see the Spirit of the Lord working throughout this entire scene. and the ropes that were on his arms and wrists became like burnt flax and fell off. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Again, I would love more details, wouldn't you? Like, how does that happen? I couldn't kill 1,000 people with a grenade launcher. Samson takes the jawbone of a donkey and kills 1,000 people. Then Samson said, comes up with his own little song. With the jawbone of a donkey, I've piled them in heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I've killed 1,000 men. When he finished speaking, he delivers what has to be a top 5 mic drop ever as he throws down the jawbone and named that place Jawbone Hil. And look, church, what a scene. What a couple of chapters. And just so you know, the party is not over yet. Now, we still have a whole nother chapter that we're going to look at next week when it comes to Samson. I think we've got to stop and ask, what can be our takeaway? So what can we take away from what we've seen this morning? I think we'd agree, not much good, right? Like, I hope we're not reading this and thinking what the world needs is more Samsons. Like, we need more people setting foxes on fire and taking jawbones and beating people to death. That's really not what we need. Look, the question we've got to answer, why was Samson, why was he so strong on the outside but so weak on the inside? So what led him to do some of the things that we just read that he did? Because again, understand, while God used the flaws of Samson, God never forced Samson to be flawed. He didn't force Samson to make all of these wrong decisions. Look, I think the first thing we see, so the very first issue with Samson that plays somewhat into everything else. For Samson, the man just could not control his impulses. Like, think back to the beginning of chapter 14. What happened? He saw a woman, and he wanted her. He said, Mommy, Daddy, that's the one I want. Go get her for me. For Samson, he saw the honey in the lion. He thought, hey, this looks good. It's going to taste good, so why not go ahead and eat? Even with his anger and how he responds to the Philistines, he does something immediately. He retaliates when they do something to him or his people. So for Samson, just like for basically all of Israel at that time, you see Samson was driven by his lusts. Samson was one of those people, if it looked good, if it seemed good, then go get it. Then go do it because it must be good. Look, Samson is a completely sensual man in the most basic definition of the term. For Samson, his senses controlled him. He reacts to how he feels, to what he sees, without even thinking about the consequences. Without even thinking, hey, why might this be a bad thing? No, he sees, he likes, and so he takes. I think this brings out to us this morning, point number 1, what we can learn from Samson. Just because something looks appealing doesn't mean it won't end up destroying. You see, just because something looks good, just because something feels good, just because something seems good, doesn't necessarily mean it's for our good. Look, the truth is, there are so many areas in our lives that this plays out. There are so many areas that we tend to be senses-driven. And what I mean by that is that we tend to go with our gut in most of our decision-making. So we think, hey, if this will make me happy in the moment, then I might as well do it. If this is appealing as it appears to be, then why not? Right? Then why not drink that? Then why not take that? Why not smoke that? I mean, at least it's going to bring me a little bit of relief, isn't it? At least it's going to help me numb the pain temporarily. Look, it feels good. Then why not pay somebody back who deserves it, right? Then why not get revenge on somebody who has wronged us? Because in the moment, at least we'll feel a little bit better about the situation, won't we? If it feels good, then why not swap that credit card? Even though we're in so much debt, we can't pay our bills now. If it feels good, then why not flirt with that coworker who's married? It's just innocent, right? It's just fun. If it feels good, then why not lie on our taxes about how much money we make, right? This is the point in the service. Everybody looks down, never looks up at me to make eye contact. Look, the truth is, I'll be honest with you. My initial impulse is always to lie on my taxes. It is. Like, I know that if we just fudge a few numbers here and there, man, we could save a lot of money. But I also know I've got to equate what seems right to me with what God has said is right. Look, Psalm 101 says, no one who practices deceit shall dwell in my house. Proverbs 6 says that God detests a lying tongue, and I think we could kind of extend that out to me, a lying pen. And so that's why I don't lie on my taxes. And also because my wife won't let me lie on my taxes. So mainly fear of God, a little bit fear of my wife. But look, my point with all of this, whatever it could be in your life, is this. We have gotten to the point in so many areas of life that we lack self-control, don't we? You know what the Bible says about the lack of self-control? In Proverbs 25:28, it says, a man or a woman without self-control is like a city broken down. It's like a city without walls. In other words, it's chaos. Look, I can address this one too. When it comes to our lack of self-control. When it comes to us oftentimes giving in to our impulses. Men and maybe even some women. And our common addiction to pornography. And look, if you're here and you're addicted to pornography, I'll just say it. I've been there. I know what it's like. All throughout college, I was addicted to pornography. Felt like I couldn't help but be involved in it. I know the struggle. I know how hard it can seem to escape, but I also can tell you there is an escape. I can tell you, with the Spirit's help, you can control your impulse. Look, I can tell you by the grace of God. I haven't looked at pornography once in the 10 years I've been married. It's not because I'm so disciplined and so strong, but because God is so good. Because if we are willing, He will work in and through us. And look, it's not that I've not been tempted. It's not that I'm still not tempted. It's because God has shown me that just because something looks appealing, it doesn't mean that it won't end up destroying. I've learned that momentary feeling, it's not worth it. It's like J.D. Greear said, if we don't learn to deny ourselves and obey the will of God, we are going to wreck our lives. This is what's happening here for Samson. For Samson, it's clear. He was driven by what looked good, what felt good. And that's one of the reasons for his weakness. He couldn't control his impulses. But not only could he not control his impulses, secondly, he wouldn't obey what he'd been called to. Because again, I mentioned it earlier. Last week we talked briefly about this Nazirite vow. And so in this Nazirite vow, that meant that you had made an oath that you were vowed to not do 3 things. You couldn't cut your hair. Essentially, you couldn't drink. And you couldn't touch anything dead or unclean. But again, think about it. What have we seen throughout these chapters? Samson doing the very things he had vowed to never do. So with the lion and the honey, he wasn't supposed to touch anything dead. But not only does he touch it, what does he do, church? He eats out of it with the dead donkey's jawbone that he killed 1,000 dudes with. He wasn't even supposed to pick it up. With this week-long wedding celebration where his girl is crying and nagging him the whole time. You don't think he was drinking at that? Yeah, he was drinking at it. Of course he was. We're going to see next week, eventually, he's going to cut his hair. So the evidence is there. He was unfaithful to the vow. He didn't live out what he was called to. And look, for us, I think that should have us doing a little bit of examination in our lives as Christians. Like, that should make us ask ourselves, hey, what have we been called to as Christians that we are not actually living out? Maybe you're here and God is calling you to do something in the church that you're saying, hey, I don't want to be a part of that. Maybe God is calling you to do something where you work that you're trying to take a step back from. Maybe God is calling you to do something locally, internationally, in missions that you are trying to run from the call. You're trying to be like Jonah. Look, I can't tell you exactly what God is calling you to, but I can tell you what He's calling us all to, and that is holiness. The Bible is clear. He is calling us to be obedient to what He has said. And look, hear me, we cannot compromise our obedience. It's so easily done, but it's not what God wants for our lives. That's why our second thing that we learn from Samson is this: obedience to what God has said isn't to be treated casually, but must be lived out consistently. This was one of Samson's downfalls. He had started treating God's commands for his life casually. He really wasn't giving it any thought. And look, it doesn't take long before casual obedience turns quickly into complete disobedience. And so Samson was weak because he couldn't control his impulses. He wouldn't obey what he'd been called to obey. Then thirdly, he shouldn't have made it all about him. So a lot of wouldn't, couldn't, shouldn'ts for Samson. Because look, let me ask you, what have we seen throughout this entire scene? Have we not basically seen Samson doing whatever Samson wanted to do, right? Samson wanted the girl. Samson wanted to prove how smart he was with this riddle. Samson was the one who wanted revenge for his people and for himself. Even think about that little song he did about the jawbone of the donkey. He said, with the jawbone of this donkey, I've piled them in heaps. I've done it. With this jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men. Samson saying, look at what I've done. Look at how powerful and mighty I am. You see the problem for Samson, sometimes the problem for us, number 3 this morning. The more we make life about ourselves, the more prone we are to get upset when life doesn't go our way. And we all know this to be true, don't we? I think we do. I know it. Like when I'm in Jesse is all that matters mode, which happens 2 or 3 times a day, really. I wish it was more like 2 or 3 times a year, but really it's 2 or 3 times a day. But if something doesn't happen like I want, I get kind of ticked off. I get kind of mad. Now, I'm not going to go kill anybody most of the time. I'm probably just going to pout about it. I'm going to sulk. But you see, Samson, he was so self-absorbed. He was such a worshiper of self that anything that didn't go like he wanted, anything that didn't go according to plan, sent him off the deep end. It made him so angry. And look, truthfully, this is probably why, or one of the reasons why God chose to use him. God knew Samson was going to have a short fuse. But you even see his pride. You see his self-centeredness at the end of chapter 15. Which is, I become very thirsty. And I think we'd agree, if you've killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, that probably makes you thirsty. But he called out to the Lord, you've accomplished this great victory through your servants. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? Look, Samson was so prideful. He doesn't even thank God for allowing him to do what he did. No, he just basically complains, like, God, why aren't you pouring water from heaven right into my mouth? The thing with Samson, he loved to use God's strength when he needed it. He was all about that. But he only called out to God. He only responded to God in extreme situations. Like the next time, we're not going to see Samson talk to God again until chapter 16 next week, when he's blind and tied up. Look, this morning, as we end this, I think as we hear all that's going on with Samson, don't we like to judge Samson the judge? It's true, isn't it? I mean, isn't it easy for us to say, this guy, come on now, really? He missed it by so much. Like, this guy doesn't even get it. Look, the truth is, we are all a lot like Samson. The truth is, we are a people who are driven by our lusts. We are people who obey only when it's convenient to obey. We are people who are prideful. We are self-worshipers. We are more about ourselves than anything else. But here's the question, if that's true, how do we overcome these things? So how do we not go down the path of Samson? I don't think that's the path we want to be on. But I think we keep from going down that path by first admitting that maybe we're more like Samson than we want other people to know. Like if somebody was to write a book about all of our mistakes, all our wouldn't, couldn't, shouldn'ts, we'd be just as ashamed as Samson, if not more, wouldn't we? Is that not true of your life? That's true of my life. You see, we got to admit we can be like Samson. But here's the difference. We can't let the guilt and shame of that bury us. No, instead of letting the guilt and shame just drive us to feel depressed and anxious and worried, Instead, now we do what the book has been pointing us to do, pointing us to look to the greater Samson. Because we know, you understand, if we are in Christ, all the pages of that book that could have been written about you have been erased. That through God's grace, He holds none of it against us because of what Christ did for us through His death on the cross and through His defeat of death in His resurrection. And so look, as we close out today, let me give you one more simple riddle. Who has never sinned but was punished for all sin? Who had no need of saving but gave up His own life to save? Who was strong but became weak so that we might become strong? Listen, brother, listen, sister. The answer to that riddle is the God-man. It's Jesus who is the Christ. And that's why we ain't looking to Samson to save us. No, we're looking to our great deliverer. That's why we trust in, hey, whatever weakness you're bringing here this morning, and maybe you are very weak in certain areas, it's no match for God's strength in Christ. And so I close out with this question. As we think about this entire scene with Samson, I just want you to think about it for a second. As I think about it in my life, are you driven, in your life, are you driven by what feels good? Or are you driven by what God has said is good? You see, one of these paths leads to life and joy, but the other path leads to disaster and death. Let's pray to God that we are on the right path.